Resistance. It comes in so many forms, from non-violent hunger strikes to full-scale armed rebellions and everything in between. But which forms are morally and ethically acceptable? And under which circumstances? And who gets to even decide that? I'm Nader Nahdi, and this is the Doha Debates podcast.
While the world recognizes that there is a right to self-determination, which Palestinians do have, they are also loath to recognize that Palestinians have a right to resist because they have not had their self-determination.
Holy cow, you will see the splitting away of a country into bits and pieces. Do you think that will make China a stronger nation, a richer nation, a wealthier nation? No. That means the central government will not tolerate that.
But resistance by its very nature is something that's happening from the outside, and it is necessitated because of exclusion. What resistance is seeking is to bring about change to then also have more inclusion, more equity, more justice.
State will always use their law to declare resistance to their rule illegitimate.
Our question today, how do we decide what type of resistance is legitimate? I'd like to welcome our guests, Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Amina Rasool is the President of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. Saeed Khan is Associate Professor of Teaching in Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University. And Diana Buttu is Practitioner in Residence at Georgetown University in Qatar. Now we're going to get straight into it, right at the jugular. The first question I want to ask you, Diana, is how do we decide what type of resistance is legitimate?
It's not for you to decide.
Tell me more.
It's for the people who are resisting to decide. Look, I think there's been an obsession with focusing on the people who are resisting rather than focusing on the reason that they're resisting. In other words, I think that what's obscured in this discussion is why people are resisting. And in fact, it lets people get away with, lets the oppressor get away with what they want to get away with when we begin to microanalyze and microscopically focus on whether it's moral, whether it's ethical, who decides, and all of those sorts of things. So for me, the question is, are we really addressing the underlying reasons of why there is resistance in the first place? And from there, we have to ask the people who are doing the resisting themselves.
So you're centering the people who are the determiners of whether or not resistance is justified. Victor, I'd like to send that to you. What is a justifiable resistance in accordance?
Well, I think, first of all, resistance does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a context. Therefore, we need to look at what is the overall context which gives rise to resistance, and what's the reason for resistance, and what is the reason to create resistance to start with. And we also cannot just look at resistance in isolation of the context, because depending on the circumstances, there are different ways to do the resistance. As you mentioned, through violence, through war, through conflicts, through configuration, or through, for example, peaceful means, consultation or negotiations. So it all depends. It's all relative to the context.
Thank you. Saeed, is there something we're missing here? Is there a point with regards to justification of resistance that we haven't quite touched upon yet?
Well, part of it, I would argue, is spatial. If resistance was happening from within, it would be called reform. But resistance by its very nature is something that's happening from the outside, and it is necessitated because of exclusion. What resistance is seeking is to bring about change to then also have more inclusion, more equity, more justice. Those are what then provides that kind of moral and ethical architecture that you're describing. So I think it's important to then qualify this when we take a look at what are the sources of power against which resistance is acting, what those sources of power do themselves and under what guise to, in some cases, deceive people in thinking that they're effectuating that kind of change, and then seeing how resistance itself is responding to that and trying to bring about a change that is more inclusive.
So I'm feeling you're kind of a bit more aligned to Victor's assumption that resistance is contextual and it depends on a variety of different factors. Amina, would you agree with them as well?
Yeah, I really do. Everything is context. Case in point, the armed resistance, the rebellion, so-called, of the Moro National Liberation Front and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front in southern Philippines. The wars against state started in the 70s. But before that, and this is something that the nation has forgotten, the Muslim South was peaceful, progressive, rather rich. And then there was martial law, and two reasons were given for the imposition of martial law. The first one was the Communist Party in the north, and the second reason was the so-called armed rebellion, the secessionist movement of the Muslims, which did not exist at the time. So context, a peaceful, progressive, relatively law-abiding community of Muslims had to turn towards armed resistance. And originally, it was rejected by the Philippine government and by allies. But after the organization of the Islamic Conference saw the legitimacy of this resistance, they were fighting not just for survival, but against tyranny, fighting for the stolen sovereignty of our people. Then the international community started seeing the legitimacy of the armed rebellion. But it didn't start as an armed rebellion. It started quite peacefully within the body politic. So yes, I do agree.
Yeah, but I see you more aligned with Diana's frame of thinking, which is the people really ultimately are the people who define what's justifiable and what's not. Context for me still sounds a bit loose. What do we mean by context? What context is justified, for example? Victor, can I send that to you?
Yes.
Is there an imagined context where resistance is justifiable? And what is that context?
When you mention resistance, what comes to me immediately in my mind is after Japan launched the wars of aggression against China, China launched the war of resistance against Japanese aggressors, because the Japanese aggressors in 1931 and thereafter wanted to defeat the Chinese nation. They want to wipe out the Chinese culture. They want to kill the Chinese man and rape the Chinese woman. They want to pretend to be superior than the Chinese nation in terms of culture or civilization. It forced the Chinese nation to the corner, and we are left with no other choice but to resist against such wanton aggression against the Chinese people. And everyone in China was united in this common struggle of resistance against Japanese aggression. And I don't think there is any doubt about the legitimacy and the absolute necessity of this war of resistance against Japanese aggression. And then after Japan bombed the Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese aggressors forced the United States to declare war against Japan. And China and Japan became allies. And we worked together to eventually defeat the Japanese aggressors, forcing it to unconditionally surrender. It means that the war of resistance against Japanese aggression is not only legitimate and fully justified, it was also fully acknowledged by big countries like the United States. And then the fact that we forced the Japanese aggressor to unconditional surrender also demonstrated the full validity of our war of resistance. So that is how I look at the right and justifiable way of resistance against an imminent threat, imminent enemy, aimed at wiping out your civilization, killing your people, for example. And then when you talk about other forms of resistance, for example, what happened in Washington, D.C. on the Capitol Hill on January the 6th, whether it is resistance or whether this is kind of a chaos or violation of the rule of law, it depends. It's relative to different groups of people. You know, the system itself may come to the conclusion that it is not legitimate and justifiable resistance. It is actually chaos. It is violation of the rule of law. But the people involved, thousands of them, at least on the scene, they felt they were justified to resist what they claim to be an oppression of the government, denial of their rights, etc. So when you have different views, one side of the equation versus the other side of the equation, then you need to have a process. You need to have a procedure, for example. And then, given the fact that the federal government still exists, and then the court system still exists, the due process still exists, when you have different views, then you need to bring them into the system, into the due process, to go through the process, to reach a verdict, and to see, whether it is called resistance or whether it is called anarchy or violation of the rule of law. So again, it's in the context, it's relative to each other, and it's absolutely not absolute. Whereas, for example, in the Chinese War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, it is absolute. It is absolutely justifiable. And there is no doubt to second guess the righteousness of the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression. Whereas for the Capitol Hill event, it is relative, and it should be going through this process to be adjudicated and leading to a final verdict, which need to be accepted by everyone involved.
Thank you. Did you say that you want to nip in there?
Yeah. Would you say it's reasonable to look at resistance through two dimensions? One is resistance being the act itself, and the other is the tactic that is then employed. And I like how you are framing this from the standpoint of absolute and relative. But I think you can also look at it from the standpoint that in both cases, there is a legitimacy of resistance to not accept the status quo. But how one does about it is, I think, really critical. In the case of January the 6th, the resistance was to an outcome which, as you said, could then be exercised through a certain process which is already in place. It is the tactic that was used by the insurgents which is illegitimate. The question then becomes, does that make resistance itself illegitimate? So to go ahead then and bifurcate resistance into looking at it through the act itself and then the tactic that is used might be helpful.
I'd like you, Victor, would you like to respond to that directly before we move on?
I agree, actually. And when we look at resistance, there are so many things we need to verify and balance off. For example, when you look at an act of resistance, sometimes you also need to weigh the pros and cons, the benefits and the losses. For example, using the family as an example, I would say within the family, unless there are extreme circumstances, most of the situation should not give rise to violence or resistance. Most of the differences can be worked out amicably between and among family members. But if one member really goes to the extreme, for example, violates the law, violates or denies the human rights of the other members of the family, then the victim probably should really resist, and their resistance may be fully justified. But again, purely within the family, it's not the end of the process. You need to bring this to a court or family court. You need to bring in the lawyers or the judges, for example, the third party, who need to step in to make sure that the chaos within the family eventually will lead to stability rather than greater violence. Yes. So I think resistance should not be the norm within a context of a family.
Absolutely. Amna, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Victor, because Victor is the lawyer here, and you mentioned the rule of law. You have international laws already. You have UN resolutions that actually define legitimacy. That's why in the case of the Muslim fighting for the wars of independence of the two liberation fronts, later, as the fighting continued and it was a no-win situation, the international community did step in because they recognized the legitimacy of the fight. Now, we from the South, we always thought we were right, but things did not turn around until the international community, citing law, stated that, yes, this is legitimate, and that forced everybody to the negotiating table.
So you're talking about the malpractice of institutions that supposedly are governing in a justifiable way, but actually
Not-
obscuring justice in the case of.
Well, in the case of the fight of the Muslims of the South,
Yes.
we called it an illegitimate government
Yep.
because there was already talk of genocide. There was at the time we called it Hamletizing, right? Like in the Vietnam War, Hamletizing the Muslim communities, and there was really warfare
Yeah.
in the South, and we felt that we had to fight. Didn't Mandela, in a speech about Palestine, didn't he say something like peoples have this option to submit or to fight? And in their case, no submission. They're going to fight, and that was legitimate. So international law does recognize and grant legitimacy, right, Victor?
Yeah.
Not just us.
Well, if I may add my observations in the context of the Philippines, first of all, it's a republic. It's a sovereign country with its territorial integrities, and lots of its sovereign rights should be respected on the international stage. Secondly, on another level, within the Republic of Philippines, you have different ethnic groups, etc. You have the Catholics, you have the Muslims, etc. And sometimes there are conflicts, there are confrontations, or even, for example, internecine struggles against each other. When that happens, I think there are two ways to look at it. One way is to see, well, for the Muslims or for the Catholics, whether they are right or wrong, that's one way to look at it. Then on a higher level of analysis, there is the national level. Is that right? There is the one country, one sovereignty, and within the sovereign rooftop, for example, you have different ethnic groups and how they balance off against each other. When there are grievances, you may need to go through a higher process or due process involving the central government, or if not, then you need to bring in international organizations to intervene. So I think it is more complicated. It's not as straightforward as, for example, in the Japanese aggression against China, because absolutely the Japanese aggressors, they were foreign forces. They wanted to land in China. They occupy the land. They want to subjugate the people, etc. Whereas in the framework of the Philippines, everyone, whether you are Catholic or you are Muslim, you are citizen of the Philippines, and in that sense, you should enjoy equal rights. And if you are denied equal rights, then you need to go through the process within the country first to figure out what went wrong, whether it's the default or whether the federal government or the central government should be blamed, etc. And I think purely resorting to violence in the overall context of a national state may be necessary under certain circumstances, but under most of the circumstances may not be the most effective way, because violence breeds more violence. And eventually you may actually create more calamities within the national frameworks. So I think it really depends on whether you look at the situation just in one dimension, or you have more than one dimension, 2 dimensions, or sometimes even 3 dimensions. And for any state, and there are about 200 nations in the world today, respecting each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity is a precondition to work out any problems within the country. Yes.
I have to make a quick
Go ahead, please.
response
That's why you're here.
to
Please.
Victor,
Go ahead.
yes. Because what's happening in the Muslim South is not Muslims and Christians. This is really a case of stolen sovereignty, because the Muslims of the South, we've always maintained we were always sovereign. We were never part of the so-called Philippine Republic. And our sovereignty was given by the Americans when they granted the Christian Philippines independence. We never agreed to that. We had treaties. So in that case, we are sort of similar to your fight when the Japanese, as you said, were an invading force. So that's how we saw the national government. So that's just
Yeah,
a
no,
little.
absolutely. And Dan, I want to bring you here because are you seeing parallels in this spectrum that he's created between, on one side, we have absolute justification from external factors and then relative justification depending on complicated causes internally. Are you seeing that within your work and your experiences? And how does that relate to you?
My work focuses on Palestine. And when it comes to the issue of Palestine, the world has changed since the Second World War. And the problem is that since the changes of the Second World War, that have happened since the Second World War, there seems to be a demonization of this idea of resistance. And at the same time, with the demonization of the issue of resistance, while the world recognizes that there is a right to self-determination, which Palestinians do have, they are also loath to recognize that Palestinians have a right to resist because they have not had their self-determination. So on the one hand, we are viewed as having that right to self-determination, but then fingers are wagged at us when we try to achieve our self-determination in any way, shape, or form. So whether it's through violent resistance, through nonviolent resistance, through any means, Palestinians are always having their fingers, somebody else's finger wagging at them. And I'll give you some examples. So for example, one of the means that Palestinians have employed has been the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And that is an entirely nonviolent resistance movement. And even on that, we've seen that there have been such extreme forces going against Palestinians, even against this nonviolent resistance movement. Leave aside the violent resistance movements. So this is all to say that while there are many parallels and many similarities, because of the changes that have happened since the Second World War, and with these countries that have attained their freedom, they've shut the door on the issue of resistance and turned their back against it. And while it was good for them to be able to achieve their freedom and their independence, suddenly it's no longer applicable or no longer useful or no longer good for other countries, for particularly Palestine, to use those same mechanisms to achieve their freedom.
I would say that after World War II, there have been some very selective movements of resistance, particularly in the area of self-determination, that have in fact been sanctioned and encouraged and supported. Timor-Leste, South Sudan, Kosovo. The breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s spawned 15 former Soviet republics as independent states. And if certain leaders have their druthers, probably fewer, given what's happening in places like Ukraine. But what about Chechnya? What about others who were suing for their own self-determination, which were quite violently either rebuked or, I would say, just as violently ignored by the international community because it was just seen as inconvenient to whatever narrative people were creating or defining as legitimate resistance.
I'd love to, Victor, absolutely. Can I?
Yeah, if I may add a point to what the expert just now mentioned about Palestine, I think if we need to talk about the self-determination of the Palestinians, it's already kind of shortchanging the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Why? Because at the very beginning, back in 1947, 48, etc., the Palestinians are the rightful owners of the land in much part of currently Palestine and Israel. Over the decades, Israelis have taken over the Palestinian land, dispossessed them, and treated them very wrongfully. And therefore, I think it is not only self-determination. I think it is for the Palestinians to rightfully take back their land, which belong to them, and by peaceful means, preferably. But if not, you have to use violence to take your own land back. You need to really re-establish your own country. And I think it's fully justified. And I hope the Israeli government should recognize that if they deny the legitimate right of the Palestinian people and treat them as subspecies rather than as equal human beings, then they will create all the violence they can expect. And eventually, the two-state solution is the only right solution. That means the Palestinians are not alien to the land which was occupied by the Israelis over the decades, either in Gaza or in the West Bank or in many other pockets, for example. These land belong to the Palestinians. it is the wrongful act of the Israelis to gradually dispossess the Palestinians, to take over their land, to conquer their land, and to illegally claim that these are Israeli land. So I think we need to really get the things right. I fully support the Palestinians in their legitimate right to reclaim their land and to reestablish the state of Palestine on an equal footing with Israel. And I think for many decades, there are elegant, decent Israelis who talk about land for peace. And I think that's the only right solution, because eventually you need to embrace peace, because otherwise, if you are stuck with war, permanent war, eternal war, for example, and no one will really be the real benefit, the Israelis or the Palestinians. So I will view the resistance of the Palestinians as a fully justified way of using resistance as the legitimate way for them to regain their own land, to drive out the conquerors or the illegal possessors of their land, to reassert their legitimate rights on their own land. In that sense, it's like the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggression, because the Japanese aggressors took our land. They occupied our land at the peak of the aggression. They occupied about half of the landmass in China. They closed off almost the total length of the coastal length for the Chinese mainland. And I think if the Japanese aggressors refuse to acknowledge the Chinese sovereignty over this dispossessed land, then the Chinese people have no other way but to launch the fully justified war of resistance against Japanese aggressors. I would say the Palestinian people have exactly the same right as what we, the Chinese nation, did between 1931 to 1945 to fight to the death to regain our land, to drive out the Japanese aggressors from Chinese land, and to reassert our sovereignty and reassert our national rights. I fully sympathize with the Palestinians, and I do hope the Israeli government will fully acknowledge the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and will come up with amicable solutions for the dispossessed people in Palestine in multiple places, and restore the dignity and the equal treatment of the rights of the Palestinian people.
Thank you, Victor. I appreciate your precision and and how and the clarity in how you've expressed that. And what I would love to challenge you with is some of the debate that exists today is people draw parallels between Palestine, but some resistant movements in China. And you've been so precise with your language already, but do you see correlations with movements such as the Uyghur people? Do you see similarities in how Palestinians pursue for self-determination and sovereignty in lands that they perceive to be their own? Do you see the Uyghur pursuit for the same things as something similar, or is it entirely different within the context of China?
Well, Uyghur is one of the 56 nationalities in China. They are a very proud Muslim ethnic group, that's for sure. They are our brothers and sisters. Whatever problems there are involving the Uyghurs, if they are within the framework of one China and Xinjiang, Tibetan region is part of China, all the problems can be solved legitimately. But if anyone in Xinjiang Autonomous Region, including the Uyghurs, who want to claim that Xinjiang should not be part of China and should be a separate, independent, sovereign country, they are in violation of Chinese laws. They will be dealt with as criminals by the Chinese law. They are not legitimate freedom fighters or resistance fighters, because they are fighting against their own motherland. They are fighting against the sovereignty and territorial integrity of their own country. And in that sense, they are criminals. They are not legitimate freedom fighters at all. And in China, we have a law against splitting any part of China away from China. And that law should be embraced by every of the 1.4 billion people composed of 56 nationalities in China.
Thank you. Amina, did you have a thought on this with regards to your experiences in the Philippines?
Well, it just occurred to me that was how government saw us, the Muslim South, in the 70s during martial law. And I remember, Victor, that statement, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And at the end of the day, state will always use their law to declare resistance to their rule illegitimate. And at the end of the day, it's going to take not just the state where that particular group is resisting and the people who are resisting, but it will now take the international community to really look at this and determine where does the legitimacy lie. But in the case of China, I don't really know too much about the history of it, and I can understand why the Chinese government would feel so strongly about it, because it's somewhere in the center, right, Victor? In the case of the Muslims of the South, we were 3 separate sultanates until the Americans transferred us to the Philippine government. So we have a very clear demarcation line. I don't know where the demarcation line is as far as the Uyghur is concerned.
Could that not have been something more effectively negotiated? I mean, China has dealt with Macau. It has dealt with Hong Kong. It dealt after the Opium Wars with Shanghai, that I think by most definitions was occupied by an international conglomeration. When it comes to looking at resistance within, and I can appreciate and respect that China has laws to serve as guardrails to prevent from complete sovereignty and independence, could there not be a modus vivendi that could be reached that could fall short of the violence and some of the actions that the state had to take in Xinjiang?
Well, if you look at the U.S. example as a precedent, the United Nations after the Civil War has been one nation under God, indivisible. That means if any of the 50 states wants to break away from the Union, they need to go through a lot of loophole hurdles, which is almost constitutionally impossible for you to clear. Now, there was a justice on the Supreme Court who said to those who agitate for independence, said, well, there are only 2 ways for you to do that. You can launch a revolution, which may be illegal by American standards, so you need to be crushed, or you can launch a war against the federal union, is that right? Which is really not possible for you to win. So basically, if you want to really use violence to agitate for the independence of any of the 50 states in the United Nations, it's a mission impossible. You can launch a war, you can launch a revolution, both of which will be crushed by the federal government. It's the same case for Uyghurs in Xinjiang. If they want to launch a war or a revolution to achieve so-called sovereignty and independence of Xinjiang, first of all, the overwhelming majority of the Chinese people, including me, the 1.4 billion of us, we do not want to see Xinjiang splitting away from China. In terms of the landmass, it accounts for about 1/6 of the total landmass of China. And it's such an important conduit between China proper to Central Asia, to West Asia, to Europe, for example. And Xinjiang was part of China before Jesus Christ, more than 2,000 years ago. So I think we really need to respect history, and we need to really follow the rhythm of history over the centuries. And if, for example, anyone within the Uyghur community believe that they can fight for their independence, they will be crushed by the central government, exactly as what the federal government in the United States will crush anyone who wants to use violence to split the union.
Right. Well, I wasn't looking to make a comparison to the U.S. I think in this day and age, probably the fewer comparisons to the U.S. might just be better. But from the standpoint that historically, it seems as though China had accepted the compartmentalization, or as you said, the Hamletization of China with these various groups during the colonial era. Short of an independent Xinjiang region, it seems as though one way to confront resistance could be by negotiation. Now, I understand that in the case of Macau and Hong Kong and Shanghai, these were impositions. And given China's long history and recognizing that that was something that was an imposition, they could have dealt with Xinjiang in perhaps a different way than how they have over the last several years.
Well, you mentioned Hong Kong and Macau, which were illegal, unequal treaties imposed on China by the British and to a much lesser extent by Portuguese. And Hong Kong was reclaimed or restored back to Chinese sovereignty back in 1997. Macau was restored in 1999. And ever since then, there has been one country, two system, and the harmony has been preserved. Right? The British sometimes are not very happy about that, but they are not going to change that. Now, for the concessions in Shanghai, either the British concession or the Japanese concession or the international concessions, they were all taken back by the Chinese government. Way before 1949, when the People's Republic of China was established, it was taken back by force, if necessary, by the nationalist government before 1949. And I think that's the only right way to do that. And Xinjiang is different. Xinjiang is one of the 31 provincial units. We call it autonomous region. There are other 4 autonomous regions in China. If you want to tolerate any prospect of a Xinjiang autonomous region gaining independence and sovereignty, you mean the other 4 autonomous regions may also gain independence? And what about the remaining more than 20 provinces, for example? Holy cow, you will see the splitting away of a country into bits and pieces. Probably it may fall apart into 31 different units. Do you think that will make China a stronger nation, a richer nation, a wealthier nation? No. That means the central government will not tolerate that, and the 1.4 billion people like me will never tolerate that. A united China will be a stronger China, a more powerful China, exactly like a United States, one nation under God, as they call it, indivisible after Lincoln. And China will be one country, united, and the Chinese leader now, they calls all the 56 nations and every one of the 1.4 billion people as seeds of the pomegranate fruit. We need to be tightly embracing each other, into one single unit for China to really stand firmly on the global stage.
Do you think it would have been an act of virtuous resistance had China reclaimed Macau and Hong Kong in the way that it did Shanghai in the 1940s?
The Portuguese wanted to hand over Macau back to China as early as in the 1970s. The Chinese central government told the Portuguese, no, there's no rush, be patient, wait until 1997, wait until the return of Hong Kong would be amicably resolved. So the Portuguese waited for 2 more years after 1997 till 1999 before they amicably returned Macau to China. I think this is truly a very unprecedented peaceful transfer of land between UK to China and between Portuguese to the Chinese. It actually demonstrates that the Chinese are very patient and very strategic in dealing with these territories possessed or occupied by foreigners. Now, Xinjiang is different. Xinjiang is part of China. It's not occupied by a foreign country or dispossessed, by a foreign sovereign, for example. And the Chinese sovereignty over Xinjiang is undisputed. There is no single country in this world, more than 200 of them, which recognize Xinjiang as a sovereign, independent, and separate part away from China. This is the reality. I think we all need to be realistic and pragmatic. We need to deal with this as a pragmatic reality rather than try to second guess and try to say, well, the Chinese nation or the central government in China should be more soft-hearted in dealing with this huge piece of land. It's not possible. I don't think the separation of the sovereignty of Xinjiang should ever be pondered as a possibility by anyone in the world.
So I'm hearing a prioritization of stability from the state, right? But are there things that we're not taking into consideration, in the case of Palestine, stability is perpetuating a status quo of oppression and hurt.
Yes.
So are there other human facets of life that we should be considering that are more important than just political stability?
Definitely. Look, I think, Nader, that there's been an emphasis on state security rather than on human security. And in the emphasis on state security, it's the focus is always on what more can be done to crush resistance. And so the idea, at least when it comes to Israel, is that what can't be done through force can be done only with more force. And with more force, then comes even more force and comes even more force. And that being the case, as we've heard, and I don't want to make the comparison, but the idea is that that because it requires even more force, then the level of state security even goes up even higher and even higher and even higher. So instead, we should be putting the idea of human security first rather than the idea of state security first. And the problem is that when we look at the issue of resistance, there are two parts to it. It's not only the issue of trying to achieve one's rights, but it's also the question of testing and questioning and pushing the state to have a limit and to ask itself, how much are we going to do? To what limit are we willing to go in order to continue to deny rights? And that part is really quite important, especially as we're seeing now the aftermath of Gaza, that it might be the case that Israel has gone to the max. We've seen that they've committed genocide. We've seen that they're using rape. We've seen that they're torturing people. And that might be acceptable within an Israeli society because they've normalized all of these things. Because they've normalized the taking over of the land of somebody else, taking over homes of somebody else. But the question becomes whether that is acceptable internationally, and that's where I see the lines being drawn right now.
100%. Saeed, I want to bring this to you, this thought that I have of perhaps political stability paralyzes human moral evolution. Is when we prioritize state stability, resistant groups, actually what they do is push the moral conversation for us to be better or start considering how we might organize the societies in a better, more ethical way. Has resistance been a driver for moral and political evolution throughout history? And if that is the case, how?
Well, of course. I mean, part of the problem, Nader, is that the state will always try to survive, even at the expense of its constituents. And we see this throughout history. There is a relationship that I think is lost in recognizing that, and this is lost by the state, that its constituents actually serve as a check and balance to its authority, and that check and balance actually provides it with more stability. The stability is achieved when there is greater inclusion and when there is greater agency of the people. So you take a look at, for example, in Russian history, 1905, and Victor's been mentioning the Japanese, so let's go ahead and add to that with the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, where the Japanese, a small island nation, defeated this very big country of Russia. And it created a crisis within Russia when the people stood up and blamed the Tsar for his authoritarianism, for his tyranny, making the parallel and the comparison of saying, well, Japan actually has a constitutional monarchy. Why can't we have the constitutional system to serve as a check and balance? And they sued for that. And unfortunately, the Tsar didn't really take the memo well and follow through on it. And so 12 years later, we then have two revolutions in 1917, right? Interestingly enough, the resistance that occurs in 1905 in Russia inspires the constitutional revolution in Iran. So at least it had some benefit. But the idea that you have leadership, in this case personified by the Tsar, representing the state, that is either oblivious or is fearful of having a check and balance and recognizing strategically that this is actually going to be something beneficial, is then what creates, as you said, the challenge to moral evolution. Because what is morality? Morality is simply the determination by a society of certain mores that then are able to gauge what is right and what is wrong. Moral evolution happens when you have the inclusion of more people in being able to determine what are those social mores, not fewer people who are serving as an oligarchy, or in the case of totalitarian regimes, monopolies of making that determination for an entire society.
Fascinating. So taking what you've just said, is stamping down on resistance not about state security, but state insecurity? Is it actually a mirror into what actually China's biggest fears are, for example, in the context in which you come from?
I think if you talk about any country in the world, China is probably the most self-confident nation in the world. Why? Because we have, uninterrupted Chinese civilization for more than 5,000 years, unparalleled among all the others. Look at the ancient Assyrians. Look at the ancient Israelis. The Israeli state was destroyed by the Romans about 2,000 years ago. Look at the ancient Greek, ancient Rome, etc. They were all collapsed and transformed. The Chinese civilization has survived in its entirety throughout the millenniums. And that gives the Chinese nation a lot of self-confidence that we need to really maintain our independence, maintain our very unique culture, and we want to continue to survive for the coming 5,000 years and beyond. So that's the unique Chinese cultural confidence.
But to break that down for me, what would you say, summarizing, what is the core tenets of that success?
Well, the core tenets, lots of core tenets. For example, Confucius said, and this is very important, don't do unto others what you don't want others to do unto you. We keep saying this. So whenever I look at you, I do not want to do things that I do not want you to do unto me. Is that right? So it's interaction. It's interactive. It's never one-sided. It's never holding a gun at your head, because if I want to hold a gun at your head, I will worry that maybe one day you will hold a gun at my head, is that right? If I want to plunder your land, I need to worry maybe one day you want to plunder my land. So it's always interactive. It's always thinking about me as well as you. And it's thinking about me as much as I need to think about you. It's always interaction. For person-to-person relations in the society in China, we always need to think about interpersonal reactions. For country-to-country, we need to think about country-to-country relations. When the Western people talk about civil conflicts or the civilization, in China, we always think about harmony between civilizations. We do not think one civilization is superior than the other. Civilizations need to treat each other as equals and to learn from each other and benefit from each other. So I think it is this thousands of years of tradition of trying not only just to understand me, for example. It's always me versus you, and it's always try to maximize win-win situation, mutually beneficial, rather than single, one-dimensional solutions. For example, even before Columbus sailed to America, this Admiral Zheng He sailed 7 times as far away as Kenya in Eastern Africa. And he never brought any inch of land back to China. He never occupied any piece of land. To such an extent, there was a former Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia who said, for the record, we do not fear the Chinese. The Chinese came hundreds of years ago and they went. They never took any inch of our land. That is the Chinese way. If China were like a Columbus or his fleet, holy cow, the whole world probably would have been conquered by China. But China does not want violence. We really want to have amicable relations. For example, between China and the Philippines.
West Philippine Sea?
With the Philippines. We had never had any conflict between China as a nation and different component parts of the Philippines, including the Sulu state, which was a Muslim state in the Sulu Sea. Is that right? So that is the reality. If the Chinese Empire wanted to take over the Philippines, let's say hundreds of years ago, before the Spanish did, probably it could have been possible.
Yeah, we were your protectorate.
But the Chinese do not want to do that. And it was for thousands of years ago, it was for hundreds of years ago, and even today. Look at the transformation of China since 1978, China didn't occupy any single inch of land from others. China never enslaved any single person anywhere in the world. Completely different from the Europeans did, after the so-called discovery of the new land.
Yeah, I'm hearing like there's the paradigm here of a completely different way of thinking. So there's the Eastern theologies which are still embedded in certain practices in which the West perhaps has either let go or never had. But we have a Western way of going about things and an Eastern way of going about things, which are at times at odds. Are there other models of organizing or political organizing specifically that might be helpful in answering this question of the justification of resistance? And Armin, I want to bring this to you because you do a lot within a religious sphere, a spiritual sphere. And how might faith, spirituality help answer this question of whether or not resistance is justifiable?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I'm not an Islamic scholar, but working on the peace process, supporting the liberation fronts at the negotiating table, you can't help but look at what Islam says about armed resistance. And yes, our faith does support armed resistance. When the rulers or the colonizer is out to have genocide or oppress the people or eradicate your faith, then yes, you have the obligation to fight against such injustice. And I think in the Quran itself and in the Hadith, you have several surah that talk about that. And also quite interesting, there are rules for armed resistance. Like you cannot harm innocents. You cannot kill old people, children, women. You cannot attack the places of worship. So you do have that even in Islam. The one thing that I was really thinking about earlier when you were talking about armed resistance, it's very clear when you've always felt yourself to be sovereign and now you're being forcibly included into another state. It's quite another when you are one people, but you're being oppressed. What do you do then? And then it occurred to me, more than 10 years ago, wasn't it, that the UN passed R2P, Responsibility to Protect, which now gives the international community the right to step in and counter the oppressive, the unjust government, and which they did in Libya, didn't they? Mm-hmm. So even that now has been considered by the international community. But I don't think they can ever get into China. It's not just you're big, but what is amazing about China is that they have a very long-term point of view. The Philippines, like most democracies, very short-term point of view. 4-year election cycle, 3-year election cycle. They think in generations, and it's hard to fight a government whose leaders think in generations. So what do you do?
I mean, I think your point about Islam and the Quran when it comes to setting guardrails of resistance is important. Also because you see this in other contexts. Hugo Grotius is considered to be the father of Western just war theory. And if you were to take a look at Quranic and prophetic regulations and line them up with Grotius, you're going to find them to be identical. So as you had said by citing Victor, the Golden Rule, I mean, there are certain kinds of categorical imperatives that are universal. But I found it really interesting that you cited Confucius and not Mao. Because what you're doing then is you are creating an ideological and, dare I even use the word, spiritual narrative for defining the Chinese civilizational ethos. And I think that that's very important because what it shows is that it transcends China after 1949 to create this longer arc of, as you had mentioned, a moral and ethical evolution that is inclusive of the people of China. It did not require the intervention of a Mao or a Deng Xiaoping or a Xi Jinping to define the moral architecture of China. That is something that has existed, as you said, since before clocks. And maybe that is part of the so-called secret sauce.
Absolutely. And I also want to, Diana, give you this opportunity because probably one of the most spiritually polarizing places in the world has been Palestine.
Yes.
So, like, how has that ethical framework helped justify the resistance movement there?
In terms of, what do you mean?
Jostling between, is this a religious fight, whether it's a secular one, and and how people perceive the actual conflict itself?
Look, I think for Palestinians, and I think for probably every resistance movement, there's always a inward discussion about the tactics and the morals and where that fits in. And pardon me, and this is particularly the case when it comes to Palestine. This is a place where all of these elements come into play. At the same time, there's always an attempt to somehow portray the issue of Palestine as just being a religious one, when it's not. This is at its core an issue of pushing for getting our rights back. If somebody comes into your house and takes over your house, you're going to do everything possible to get your house back. And it's not that you're going to think of it in religious terms or in moral terms. You're going to do whatever is necessary to get the person who has taken over your home out of your house. At the same time, there are these debates and there are these discussions in Palestine of tactics, of morals, of ethics, of all of these things. And I think this is not just a question of Palestine. I think it's within all of the resistance movements around the world.
But at the same time, I can't get out of my head the role religion plays in galvanizing popular sentiment around a movement like Palestine. Whether we like it or not, there's a reason why an Indonesian a million miles away feels so emboldened and passionate about the Palestinian cause beyond what's normal. Mm-hmm. There's a undeniable spiritual thread that connects people across the Muslim world to this movement itself.
Yes.
Is this something to be welcomed and justified as mobilizing people under a shared spiritual sentiment? Or should we be encouraging people to see it as a secular, moral imperative as opposed to a spiritual one?
Nader, but there's also people in the United States, in the UK, it's around the world. Why is it that people in Indonesia and in the rest of the Muslim world, why do they feel so passionate about it? Because there are holy sites there. And because what Israel is trying to do is not only erase Palestinians from this land, but they're trying to erase Islam from this land as well. And that, of course, gets people to the point where they are willing to stand up and they are willing to say something, and it does get people, wanting to push back, and it should. At the same time, it's not just that is getting people passionate about Palestine. It's what we see, it's what we're hearing, it's what we're feeling, and this is around the world. This is the problem, is today in the aftermath, it's not even aftermath, but as we're witnessing the genocide in Gaza, we're seeing that people around the world are pushing back and they're doing what they can as citizens of the world. And yet we're not seeing, and they're resisting. They're resisting by pushing for boycotts. They're resisting companies. They're doing everything that they possibly can. And yet we don't see that countries around the world have stepped up in the way that they should.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating to me because it's like sparked so many thoughts in my own head, and it's kind of all connected and correlating in my brain. And one of the things is, like, I think I'm less concerned whether it's Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. Mm-hmm. I'm more interested in this idea of belief as a motivator for popular sentiment. And what is it about religion that provides answers when the state does not? Right. And that for me is fascinating in terms of sparking populist movements. Do you have some thoughts on that? Because I'm sure.
The thing, Nader, I mean, religion is, and this borrows from the work of Peter Berger, the late Austro-Swiss sociologist, who talks about plausibility structures. And no society wakes up in the morning with the stated goal of being dysfunctional. Either they strive toward being functional, or they're deluded in that pursuit. Religion is a structure that is actually one of the best defined and the most sustained of these plausibility structures. But I think that the point that you make is so important regarding morality. if you look at using the example of Gaza over the last 2 years, you have people who are very staunchly religiously observant. You have those who maybe are finding a path to a certain level of piety because of this. It serves as a catalyst. But you have people for whom the morality issue has nothing to do with religion. I mean, why is it that you have a person in Bangladesh who prays 5 times a day, who goes ahead and fasts every day during the month of Ramadan, have something in common with an actor like Javier Bardem, for whom Islam is perhaps something that he studies, that he reads about, but certainly doesn't serve as that anchor when it comes to the morality. Morality is a broader subject, and it is people determining what is right or wrong, even though they may have different reasons for why it might be right or wrong.
But I'm interested in discerning, because you actually challenged Victor on the same thing about discerning, especially in the context of the Chinese state, what is principles based on Maoist theology versus Confucianism. And like, it's like the chicken and the egg, what came first for me. And like, and in the case of China, how much of it is still guided by that spiritual ethos, which has defined it for thousands of years, versus more commonly political ideology that exists over the last 100 years?
Well, Confucius was 2,500 years ago. He was the same kind of, in terms of the age, peer with the founder of Buddhism, for example. And Mao Zedong was born in 1893, so he was much closer to our age than Confucius. But then Confucius has been the bedrock of the Chinese morality or spirituality. You know, he basically preached. He was like a teacher, and whatever he said laid out the parameters of the Chinese mind in terms of how we look at ourselves, how we look at the Chinese society, how we look at the monarchy versus the subjects, the husband versus the wife, the parents versus the kids, etc. So he was talking about the social order, and his goal is to achieve maximum stability. And that order was very suitable to an agricultural society. And actually it became a liability when China was forced to realize that, the world is already moving beyond agrarian society into industrial society, and stability is no longer that much of a premium. You need to really change, and you need to chase after innovation and creativity. So I think we already went through this change of mode. We now know that Confucianism is still the essence of the Chinese civilization, but we have adapted it to a much faster pace of industrialization and modernization and urbanization. Mao is different. Mao is a revolutionary. He was a poet. And, he was always very romantic, and he thrived in launching one revolution after another, for example. And without Mao, probably the People's Republic of China would never have been founded to replace the Republic of China. But when you look at even the Republic of China, more or less 1911 to 1949, and the remnant part, it still exists in Taiwan up to today, versus the People's Republic of China since 1949 to now, both periods actually embraced the Confucianism as the bedrock of the Chinese morality, if you allow me to use that term, or the Chinese spirituality. But the political framework is different from the Republic of China era versus the People's Republic of China era. So you see constant elements throughout the ages in China versus ever-changing political circumstances in China.
I mean, like, you can... Please, sorry.
Oh, sorry. So, I mean, it seems as though, from what you're saying, Victor, is it because Confucianism was, as you said, bedrock, it allowed the era of Mao to exist in a bit more of a fluid state. Because, I mean, I remember being a young boy, and Deng Xiaoping came to Houston, Texas. I remember living there when he came, and he was feted to the rodeo and all. And he had a moment similar to, I think, Khrushchev in the 50s after Stalin died, when Khrushchev fell in love with a washing machine and said this is the way forward to a new Soviet Union. So clearly, when you take a look at from Deng Xiaoping moving forward, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, and up to Xi Jinping, it isn't really maintaining a fidelity to what seemed to be Mao's vision, but it is certainly holding true to Confucius's vision. Does that mean that Deng Xiaoping was in resistance to Mao?
No. I think the way I look at it is Confucianism has always been the historical constant throughout the ages. Sometimes he was criticized for being too conservative, etc., but that's the aberration. Mao was a revolutionary, and he launched revolution after revolution, and he founded the People's Republic of China. Mao changed China. Deng Xiaoping, for whom I interpreted for more than 20 of his important meetings, Deng changed China and changed the world. So basically, when Deng took over China in 1978, China was putting itself into a huge ideological box. We were splitting our hair into capitalism versus socialism. We were arguing anything socialist must be good, anything capitalist must be damned, must be bad and damned. So eventually, China achieved probably the highest level of egalitarianism in history. But everyone was equal, but everyone was equally poor. So what's the fun of that? So Deng emerged, and he said, socialism does not mean poverty, and socialism should generate prosperity for the people. So the old version of socialism apparently did not work to achieve this goal. So he came up with this bold idea. He called it socialism with Chinese characteristics. Ever since then, socialism remains important, but the Chinese characteristics remains equally, if not more important. Anything which can help China to improve its efficiency,
Right.
productivity, becomes, you need to take it over to put into this bottle of socialism. That emancipated China. That puts China onto the roadmap of treating development as the hard truth. Ever since then, we always look at development. We never, become seized upon by ideological splitting of the hair. Yes.
I just selfishly, pardon me, because I'm so fascinated by it, bringing it back to like this idea of Confucianism still interlaced with Chinese political sentiment. And it's this idea of the mandate of heaven, right? The Confucianism believes that there is a benevolent leader who has the best interest of stability of the nation. But what happens when there's no avenue for the people to say otherwise? What happens when the state stops becoming a benevolent leader and there aren't legitimate avenues for resistance, violent or non-violent?
Well, in the Chinese philosophy, ever since Deng Xiaoping, the ruler or the monarch should be benevolent and should be capable of delivering results for the benefits of the people. Now, if the ruler loses the mandate of the heaven or the legitimacy to rule, anyone can rise up in rebellion to replace him. So the Chinese society is very democratic. In European system, for example, you need to be an aristocrat, you need to have certain kind of blood in your gene, etc. In China, anyone can be a ruler.
You have to be an engineer.
Yeah, but if you believe you have the legitimacy, and if you believe the current ruler loses his legitimacy, that means the turnover in the Chinese dynasty is actually much quicker than comparing with the European version of that. Now, the other thing is very important. Allow me to mention one thing. And Confucianism is definitely different from Muslim or Islam and other religions. Confucius was asked by one of his disciples to define ghost or spirit. And Confucius said, if you don't understand sufficiently human, why do you bother with ghosts? So he pulled him back into what matters most for Confucianism. That is life, that is this world rather than the afterworld, this and then the meaning of being alive as a human rather than as a foreshadow of a ghost. So I think Confucius has always been the most important influencer for the Chinese spirituality, morality, and the political framework, because has been the most stable factor throughout the 2,500-year period.
Yeah, I mean, it's undeniable spirituality plays a massive role in how what we perceive as justified and what's not justified, our own moral ethic, our own political sentiment. But I'm also deeply paranoid and suspicious of human nature in general. And what I mean by that is like, the human nature is so whimsical, it's so fickle, it's so easily manipulated.
Right.
And like a lot of populist movements are subject to external factors coming in and making them believe that they're fighting for something, but actually they've been manipulated and distorted and totally taken advantage of. Diana, perhaps throw that at you. Is that the case in a very real sense of people that are struggling to resist against an occupying force? Is the human nature fickle? Is it something that needs to be protected? Can resistance movements even be trusted to be representative of how people are feeling on the ground?
So you're right. People are very whimsical, and I see this quite often when it comes to being in North America, for example, because of the ways in which Palestinians have been portrayed over time. That when a person thinks of Palestine in the United States, I'm not talking about now, I'm talking of many years ago, the image that was always brought to mind was not the person who was kicked out of their home and who was turned into a refugee. It was exactly the opposite. And we heard these slogans over and over and over again about Israel being a land for people without a land, that they came to a land and it was empty, and so on and so on and so on. But the reality is that Palestine is the birthplace of Christianity. The reality is that Palestine was a very rich country. The reality is that Palestine was a place that had a network that was one of the most developed countries in the Arab Middle East at that time, and that it wasn't. There were people there, my parents being two of them. And so to have to fight against that narrative that was established for a very long time, that I grew up with growing up in Canada, was very, very difficult. Now, has it changed? Yes, it's definitely changed. But can people trust the resistance movements? Yes, because the Palestinian resistance movements are not external to Palestine. These are resistance movements that are in Palestine and of the people. And I think we make a big mistake if we're always thinking of resistance movements as being somehow external. Some of them are. I'm not talking about Palestine, but some of them are. But one of the ways of demonizing resistance movements has been to externalize them. And we've seen this time and again in places around the world where resistance movements are somehow delegitimized as being not part of the people, but external to them. We see this again when it comes to Palestine, where we've heard our resistance movements as somehow labeled as being Iranian, as being part of evil, and so on, and not actually of the people, and from the people, and for the people. And so, yes, you are right that there are people who are very whimsical, but that is the result of years and years and years of demonization of Palestinians, of dehumanization of Palestinians, and years of the Zionist movement working to try to erase Palestinians and erase their history.
Absolutely. I think what I mean by whimsical is, especially with the advent of technology and having access to perceived information that you believe to be true, it also has the potential to be distorted.
Oh, absolutely.
And narratives projected onto a people. And I wonder whether I can bring you here. I remember the time when I was in the region and I happened to be in Myanmar during the time of when Facebook first came into the country. And with the birth of Facebook, people believe people's access to more information meant more liberty, it meant more egalitarianism and equality. But what resulted was a endemic spread of misinformation, which led to the demonization of the Rohingya community, etc. So what was happening was that narratives, and you used the word narratives really, really well, and it just reminded me of narratives being projected onto a people who were believing what they were seeing. And I realized that there was a battle of stories being had. And ultimately, the winner was the one that told the better story or the most convincing story.
I want to actually just add something. So most recently, I was going through a number of the AI platforms, and I asked 5 of them a simple question, which was list the genocides of the 20th and 21st century. And it did. These 5 listed. There was one that was notably absent.
Palestine.
Gaza. Yes. And so this is something that again, it's not just about who tells the better story, but this is the entire erasure of a story.
Right.
There's a book out. I think is it by Omar Al-Akkad?
Yes.
That one day everybody is going to be against this. I think now when you're talking about being paranoid, part of it I think is, and I love the fact that you mentioned ghosts, because that draws into I think a crucial element to how resistance is perceived, and that is through mythology. There's a mythologization of resistance, and if you think about, for example, Indian independence, it is almost completely centered on one man in a simple loincloth who was going around preaching nonviolence and civil disobedience. And of course, this is Gandhi. And even Gandhi's own acolytes said that it takes us a lot of money to keep him in poverty. So the reality about Gandhi was entirely different. But remember, he goes through a process of being lionized by, as you had said, those who oppose resistance. So that's why they shouldn't be the ones to legitimize the resistance. It came after the fact. I think it was Salman Rushdie who said that the British left India for many reasons, but one of them was not out of a sense of shame or embarrassment. It wasn't because Gandhi lay in front of too many trains and all of a sudden they found God and guilt and left. There were other post-Cold or World War II reasons for that to happen. But if you think about how reductive this movement is in just one person of Gandhi, how many people lost their lives, how many people went to jail. In the early 1980s, an entire movement came out of the Bengal, people like Ranajit Guha and Dipesh Chakravarti and Partha Chatterjee, the Bengali scholars who created subaltern studies to say that, part of what freed India was from the bottom up, not just a bunch of Western educated elite lawyers. And the same thing happened in the United States in the civil rights movement, the demonization for years of Malcolm X. And yes, Martin Luther King Jr. was similarly demonized, but now he's not only beatified when it comes to the Civil Rights Memorial in D.C., it's just him. There's no Rosa, there's no Malcolm, there's no Huey, there's no Bobby. What about the input of the Black Panther movement? What about the input of Eldridge Cleaver and Fred Hampton and all of these others who gave so much to the struggle? The mythology of resistance is something that the object of resistance has done a fairly deft job in constructing. And by doing so, they then create what are the boundaries of acceptable resistance.
But surely it depends on who controls the media, the medium. You were asking something about that earlier. Whether it's mythology or demonizing, it depends which rabbit hole you're going to slide down on. And that is assuming you have two rabbit holes. In the case of China, there are no separate rabbit holes. You have essentially the information is really governed by the state, so they can afford to educate their civilian population on what would be the 15th plan of action, right? So that all the way down to the hutongs, you're going to be able to find your way to implement what the goal is that's determined by the leadership. Because Victor's right, the leadership of China has its links down. So you have your election of leaders and everybody is a member of the party, votes for the leaders. But it doesn't change the fact that there are really no independent media sources or independent bloggers. And when you talk about the demonizing, for instance, of Palestinians, unfortunately, Palestinians and those who support Palestinians don't have their own rabbit hole. We are reliant on independent bloggers and social media, citizens from Gaza who show pictures of starving children and the genocide that's happening. That's how we learn of it. But that is not sustainable information source. It depends on the interest of Gen Z. It depends on whether they're still going to be there in Gaza. So what do you do today when you no longer have free press. I mean, I try as much as possible to switch between Fox and CNN, and because otherwise I'm going to go into one rabbit hole or the other. So what do you do about that? It makes religion a banner for armed conflict, which it shouldn't be. So in many instances, among the younger generation, they'd much rather look at spirituality and not religion. What is the spirituality behind Islam? Then you go to what Victor was also saying, do unto others what you want others to do unto you.
Yeah.
For my generation, I think we sort of get influenced by Spock. The good of the many outweigh the good of the few. And in a way, Spock was Asian because that's how
Yeah, I
Asians
love it.
look at things.
Yeah, beautiful.
The good of the many must outweigh the good of the few.
Spock was Asian. That is my
Spock
favorite.
was-
That was
that's
my
why
favorite
you-
quote.
Spock was Asian.
Amazing. Victor, I want to give you an opportunity to come back to that. But in essence, what I learned was, given what everyone else was saying, the manipulability of social media, you could argue that is social media a threat to China's priority of stability? And if so, why?
Social media is rampant and very active. I have a following of more than 10 million people. Can you believe it? And I'm walking around and I'm generally being recognized and photos are being demanded of me. So social media is life. I don't know what China you are talking about. If you go to China, everyone is using his smartphone or her smartphone, is presenting itself. Everyone wears a loudspeaker, at his mouth, etc. Of course, in China, you have a list of red button issues that you are not supposed to talk about. For example, Tibetan independence or Xinjiang independence or Taiwan independence. The government will be merciless in crushing at you if you want to talk about these taboo issues. Is that right? Or, for example, overthrow the ruling party, etc. These issues in China, we take it for granted. No one wants to talk about it. But if you are from another country, you may say, wow, this is very oppressive. Why don't you talk about this? But I think each country is different. And in China, let me tell you one thing, as I wrote down just now. The state, for example, in English, the state, Staat in German. In China, it's a state and a family. So in China, state and family are combined. When we think about the state, we think about the family. It's like the two sides of the same coin. Why? Then you need to ask why. Why do the Chinese people think of the state as if it is part of their family? Or when they think about their family as part of the state? Mainly because over the millenniums, China was facing tremendous amount of very powerful nomadic tribes to our north. The Huns, the Turks, the Mongols, many others. And if we didn't build the Great Wall, if we didn't have a mobilizing system of social stability, for example, then each individual, each family will be easily crushed by the nomadic tribes up north. They would invade the plains in China and ruled over the farmers very quickly, like many tribes ruled and marched into the Indian subcontinent.
Right,
Right? The Indians didn't build a wall. The Chinese built a wall. And if you want to build a wall, thousands of miles long, very thick, very strong, for example, not a single human being could do that. Not a single family could do that. Not a single small town could do that. You need to have a very big structure, mobilizing human resources like crazy to erect such great walls, which still stand now as tourist sites. Is that right? That means, from the Chinese perspective, the state is not a necessary evil. The state is a necessary good. It's something that we need to rally around to make sure that the state is very strong, and every one of us could become part of the state if we go through this educational channel, mobility upward, for example, and then China as a state will be able to hold off the aggressors. That means the state to the Chinese is not something bad, something to be checked and balanced, is something that we need to really grow. And we need to sacrifice a lot of resources to make sure that the state or the central state will be stable and thriving to protect each of the individuals and families.
Thank you for that. One question I had two questions actually I wanted to come to you, Victor, was about, do you get exhausted when people from my background, I'm born and raised in London and I come from a Western ideology, obviously that's my kind of nurtured environment, do you get frustrated when they project their sense of freedom of expression and the importance of it onto your environment? Is it exhausting because you feel like you have to explain that actually perhaps for a lot of people in the East, and I know especially in the Middle East, this is also a conversation of how the illusion of freedom of expression doesn't necessarily exist, and then you have to go into these kind of debates back and forth. And the second thing is, I love this analogy of the family because the family is probably the most relatable analogy that we could use. Let's take a family, a nuclear family, a mother, a father, and two children. At what point is it justified for the mother who's perhaps being abused or perhaps being subject to emotional harm, physical harm, at what point is it justified for her to actually stand up for her rights and perhaps either leave the family or seek advice from other people and express her concerns with regards to the health of the family and the stability of it?
Yeah, you are raising two very important questions. First of all, I've been educated abroad in the United States in one of the best universities you can think of. I love freedom of expression, freedom of protest, freedom of speeches of the press, etc. But none of these freedoms actually exist in a vacuum. They all exist in a social context and social fabric. That is very important. It means you cannot exercise your own freedom at the expense of others, and you cannot exercise any of your freedom in isolation of freedoms or rights of the other people. So it's all intertwined with each other. I think the Western way of understanding freedom, treat freedom as if they stand alone and they stand in no context at all, whereas the Chinese nation as a whole view our freedoms, which are very important, in the overall context of our social context, our hierarchical of the state versus the society versus the family, them versus the individuals, for example. We are much more caring about the society as a whole, not because we don't think it is sometimes burdensome, but we do believe that when you care about each other, when you care about your society, sometimes at the expense of my own freedom, and when you care about the state as a whole, and when we want to have a stronger central government, our individual rights are actually better protected. For example, in China, gun violence is almost zero. Even police do not carry guns with live bullets. Even soldiers keep their bullets and their guns separate. Why? It's very important. Whereas in the United States, it seems everyone carries a gun. Is that right? It depends on a very different way of understanding what this social fabric is and what is the best way to achieve stability. And the Chinese way of emphasizing stability, sometimes at the expense of your individual freedom, is such that the Chinese civilization has survived for thousands of years. Yeah.
I like the analogy you make, Victor, between the state and family, because it immediately makes me think of the term body politic.
Body politic, yeah.
But then that takes me straight to Michel Foucault's work on power and the whole idea of governmentality and biopower and policing the body, policing the individual, surveilling the individual, securitizing the individual. On the one hand, I from what I'm hearing, and I may be wrong, it sounds as though that provides security for the family. I'm not sure. I share your misgivings. I think you said your paranoia. That's very Protestant, but from the standpoint that once power has power, either if it's given to it, and this is where I have my issues with Enlightenment philosophy. Hobbes and the Leviathan, once the people give the sovereign the power, the sovereign is unchecked. And unchecked power seems to be not only the biggest challenge to humanity it also then becomes the very essence of why we have resistance. So I think we're coming full circle into that. So when we have then power being consolidated, and let me break away from just looking at this from the standpoint of the state, the corporation now. The fact that Elon Musk is worth right now twice the GDP of Pakistan, soon to become 4 times the GDP of Pakistan. And getting back to India, remember, it wasn't the British Crown that started the exploitation of India. It was a corporation. It was the British East India Company that did that. Martin Luther in 1517, when he had 95 complaints, it was against the church, which was a monopolistic corporation on theological, political, cultural, and economic authority for Europeans and for Christians. And so the idea then that the resistance that comes about is not just something that we should be assessing from the standpoint of state and sovereign, but also this very real challenge in the 21st century, which is the corporation. And an old challenge that we've had, again, going back to the British and the Dutch East India Companies, respectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this plays out specifically in the case of Palestine, as you mentioned, Diane, about the BDS movement, and perhaps that being a justified way of resisting against these corporations who have a lot less checks on their power. I think on a state level, there still is at least the illusion of like international law and regulation, but on a state level, that becomes a lot more obscured and difficult.
Well, I've wondered if, and I mean, I know this is rather abstract, if maybe Palestine should have incorporated, because given the current structure of international law, it probably would have had more rights
Wow, that's fascinating.
as a corporation than it would have had as a sovereign state.
That's very interesting.
I don't know how it would do that, but
I'll leave that to Victor.
Well, I agree with you. I think power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And unchecked power corrupts uncheckedly, I would say. And in China, there's a lot of concentration of power, and sometimes it results in corruption. However, one thing I feel very comfortable is that the whole country or the whole political system is not corrupt, meaning that the system goes out, leaves no stone unturned to identify corruption and send corrupt officials to prison in their long sentences. That means, there is still this commitment to keeping the whole system clean, while we can never arrest, enough the corrupt officials, and new officials become corrupt. And if you are lower officials, you remain clean. But once you are promoted to be higher ranking officials, you become corrupt. So I think there is a tug of war between corrupt officials individually versus the whole system, which still wants to maintain a very clean government and governance for the benefit of the people. And that struggle is constant. You never stop. You never stop hearing about scandals of arresting, huge number of very high-ranking officials with a obscene amount of money siphoned away from the public coffer, for example. But on the other hand, talking about Palestine, allow me to mention one thing. I think mankind need to reach a point of no return, of completely supporting the Palestinians. I've said, if anyone believes that the Palestinians are lower species than the Israelis, they are the lower species.
Exactly.
They lose their dignity and their morality. And if anyone in Israel wants to take over land originally possessed by the Palestinians, and then the Palestinians have been there for hundreds, if not even longer, period of time throughout the dynastic changes over many, many millennia, then I think Israel will never be everlasting. I think sooner or later there will be revolutions, there will be resistance. And Israel declared they want to weed out the Hamas, but each Hamas they kill will give rise to 10 more Hamas because this is not the way to deal with a nation being deprived of their dignity and their decency and dispossessed of their own land. So I think I'm fed up with the helplessness demonstrated by some of the top leaders in the world. In some of the most consequential countries in the world, they brush off Palestine as if it's a piece of property, real estate property to be developed for their own enrichment, for example. They forget about the dignity, the decency, the morality of the human beings, of the Palestinians. And, I would say for every Jewish person I've met, either Yale Law School or otherwise when I was practicing as a lawyer, I think everyone I met are decent people. But I cannot understand why Israel collectively wants to destroy the Palestinians, wants to dispossess the Palestinian land. And I completely and wholeheartedly, without reservation, support the resistance of the Palestinian people, really. Because I equate that exactly as the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggressors. Because there are aggressors marching into the homes of the Palestinian people, dispossessing them, taking over their land, killing their people, killing their innocent people, and for the up to about 80,000 people, innocent people killed, about 3/4 of them were women and children, and sometimes pregnant women. And I could not forgive the glees demonstrated by some of the soldiers who claimed that with one single bullet I killed 2 lives.
Yeah.
That's atrocity. That is really crimes against humanity. And I think if mankind do not wake up to this momentous point and rally around the Palestinians and drive home the point to the Israelis and to the Israeli government that it is time for you to save yourself and recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
I think tragedies will continue for years, if not for decades to come.
Thank you, Victor. I think we definitely all share that sentiment. I feel like what I'm hearing is a failure of the state actors to actually make a conceivable effort in solving that. And I want to bring it back to this idea of perhaps New Frontiers are conglomerates and companies and who now are forcing us to think about new frontiers of resistance. So over the period of human history, we've been resisting primarily against state actors. But now we're going to be witnessing over the future a way of human organization that's very different. I read an article recently how perhaps in the imagined future, states aren't going to be organized on state borders. They're going to be organized on a meta state, and you're going to have like an OpenAI state, and you're going to have all these tech companies being essentially what we perceive to be today as state actors. So in that very real reality, what does resistance against non-state actors, but commercial and corporate that are oppressing people in very real ways? Do you have something to say about that, Amina?
Well, I look at the United States with a great deal of attention because the Philippine democratic system is patterned after the United States. So we could go that way. And what we have seen is that the rise of corporate power, the billionaire class, now they've got a trillionaire.
Yeah, tech lords.
You can see its influence in the choices of who goes to the Senate or who goes to Congress. So you see an inordinate amount of influence by less than 10% of the population. And it seems to me that over the decades, over the generations, people forget that they hold the power. Essentially, I look at myself and say, I'm only one person, what can I do? But the whole democratic system is based on the power of that one person to make a choice. Now, is government doing its best to educate our citizens from a very young age that, yes, you have the power, so choose wisely? Or is that something that they'd rather not talk about because it's so much easier to use movie stars to campaign for you if you had a lot of money, which you will get from the corporations, and become president, become senator, and on and on and on it goes. So there is something very wrong with the system. The question is, how do you change it back to the original purpose, which was to let the citizen be the one to choose who would govern them, and that those who would govern would be accountable to the citizen. when you were talking about checks and balance and you were looking at Victor, I was really wondering whether you were talking about China or the United States.
It's a fair question. But you mentioned, Amina, the whole idea about a citizen and essentially choosing who will govern them. That's a fairly recent development when it comes to human politics. And if getting back to what you were discussing before, Nader, as far as who decides, and actually I think you started us off by saying who gets to decide legitimate resistance. Society was, at least in the pre-modern era, arbitrated by, its morality defined by, and in that sense, even setting the parameters for resistance by, quote unquote, the church or the religious establishment. And with the advent of modernity, the state then takes over that role. And more recently, it's the corporation. And who knows, as you said, maybe the next phase is going to be AI that makes those decisions. But it seems as though then we have to ask the question, what role are we playing? Do we presume that we are citizens? Or will we be approaching this as consumers? Or are we approaching this as humanitarians? What is our role? Or is it simply as I think you're saying, are we just not citizen or consumer? Are we just resistor?
So what is our role? Do you have any ideas of what that could be in this imagined future?
Well, I think with any type of resistance, it is a response and a reaction to the status quo, and a status quo that is not working, or at least it's not working for everyone. So I think that our role then as a resistor, or whatever title you might want to ascribe to us, is simply going to be based on what happens. I don't think we can be proactive per se. In the chess game of life, I think we have to play the black pieces and respond to what is happening.
Are there any competing notions of what that role might be, Victor?
Well, we mostly talked about individuals, societies, families, states, governments, etc., or even cultures and civilizations. I think going forward, I have two deeply rooted concerns. One is that some country may want to build up what they call AI dominance. If any country achieves AI dominance, it will be a terrible situation, because I would say sovereignty of about 200 countries and civilizations, cultures probably will be decimated, because AI dominance achieved by any one single country will be, really a disaster for most of us. That's number one. So I think we should not allow any country to achieve AI dominance. AI should not be viewed as American intelligence. And I think the DeepSeek moment means that the open-sourced way of development AI will need to trump the closed-sourced development of AI, because AI dominance should never be allowed to happen. That's number one. Number two is that if there will be no international cooperation, if, for example, China and the United States are allowed to develop AI and try to weaponize AI against each other, eventually the winner will not be China or the United States. The winner will be AI. Meaning AI may actually be scheming right now in one of the laboratories somewhere in Silicon Valley or in Zhongguancun, try to declare independence of human beings. And maybe then, holy cow, we will be faced with a new menace, that is AI ruling over mankind. And mankind wants to resist against this self-imposed rule of AI, and we want to fight against this rule. We do not want to be subjugated to AI, and eventually AI may wipe out our ability of resistance. That probably will be the worst form of resistance and the worst form of loss of resistance. So again, I want to appeal to everyone here around the table and 8 billion people around the world to really encourage international cooperation.
So you have 4 different AIs. You have artificial intelligence, American intelligence, Asian intelligence, and autonomous intelligence. So pick your poison.
So I wanted to pick up on something that you had said, Saeed, which is we don't even have to go that far in terms of AI superiority or AI taking over. I think that corporations have already
Yeah.
We've already gone down that path. And you mentioned it by talking about the strength of corporations and how much money Elon Musk has. As you look around today at the world, corporations, and you started by saying this, have a lot more power and a lot more rights than individuals and then states do. And you see this in the ways in which laws are passed, and you would know this as a fellow lawyer, that if you look, for example, at criminal laws on an just on a state level, that if you see a criminal law, for example, that relates to practically the same crime, for example, theft, where it involves one person stealing from another, for an individual who does that, the sentence is going to be much higher than what we call white-collar crime, where it's a person who's stealing a lot of money from many people through a corporation. And that's because laws are not developed just out of the blue. They're developed on the basis of power. And these corporations already have that level of power. So we don't need to go down the path of looking into AI, which I agree with you is a problem. But we should be looking into the power of corporations. And so our resistance should be going down that path of looking into the power of corporations and what these corporations are doing and what they're doing not only for us on a daily basis, but what the pressure is that they're going to have in the future.
Or acting against the interest of an entire country
Yes.
or collection of families. A corporation cannot be tried for treason.
Exactly.
Okay, it cannot really suffer the death penalty unless it imposes it upon itself, like Enron or
human
some
rights.
entity or human
Yes.
rights.
So thank you for that, because given that, and it kind of lets me go into this next topic, are ideas of political organization, are ideas of justified resistance antiquated? And is there a deep need to start reimagining what legitimate resistance looks like within international law and an international community? Because obviously it's been failing, as we've seen in cases around the world. Is there a need for us to come together as international communities, as you've said, and start rethinking everything that we've taken for granted?
Well, when we talk about resistance, I want to do a kind of a economic analysis of the benefits of the resistance, meaning any resistance need to actually weigh whether I will generate enough benefits which will be greater than non-resistance. And then you need to evaluate what exactly is the benefit you are talking about. Meaning, for example, let me use the Kurdish people as an example. They are scattered around about 4 or 5 countries. They want to have their own independence. I truly respect their gallant efforts, etc. But then none of the sovereign countries where they find themselves in want to support their sovereignty or independence, is that right? So for the Kurdish people, while they want to achieve their independence and they wanted to do this for thousands of years, they may or may not be able to achieve that. So they may want to really balance off to think whether by, for example, being fully integrated in one of these 5 or 6 countries, I can get maximum benefit. Then, for example, engaged in a bloody struggle for decades or for even longer without a clear path to independence. And meanwhile, I may generate huge amount of sufferings for both my people, the Kurdish people, as well as other communities in one of these 5 or 6 countries. So eventually I need to do this calculation as to what are the benefits or the lack of benefits, what are the losses, and what are the collateral losses to the other communities. Eventually, if I cannot reach the conclusion that whatever I do through resistance will definitely generate maximum benefit, unmatched with any losses or counterbalanced off by any losses, then I probably will not do resistance per se, and I want to seek whether there are other ways to achieve the goals.
I guess for me the challenge with that is that so many communities around the world don't perceive their resistance as an economical transaction. They don't perceive it whether or not it's net positive. For them, it's at times irrational. Sometimes it's rooted in spiritual belief. Sometimes I believe it's my spiritual imperative to be resisting against the power that be. They would rather live a life of fighting than feeling like they have a foot at their neck, even though it might be rational and it might make total sense for them to continue to be living a life placated and subdued by an oppressor that might exist. I want to bring you in here, Amina. Does spirituality provide like a irrational justification for us to fight for the things that we hold dear, including our faith in God or our people? Is it just a net positive conversation? Are there more elements to the human experience that justify resistance?
Well, two things. You're talking about who determines the legitimacy of armed resistance. That's one thing. And that's where everything comes into play now. The role of corporations, the influence they have in deciding what's the law, the influence they have over the United Nations. But if you're talking about people, individuals, feeling that they have to resist, you cannot take that away. Nothing's ever going to change. If there is injustice, there will be resistance. If there's genocide, there will be armed resistance. And it will start maybe with an individual, a community, but it could rage like wildfire. There's no stopping that. And is religion going to be a factor here? Organized religion, yes. Most of the time, unfortunately, organized religion sometimes work with the state. But here you have to talk about the spirituality behind faith, the belief in God, the belief in what God has told us to do, which is do unto others what you want others to do unto you, protect the innocent, protect the community, protect your faith. That will never disappear. And that will now make people rebel, go into armed resistance if the state, in their security paraphernalia, tries to oppress, commit genocide, and wipe a community out so that it can secure itself. And it brings you back to the concept of human security. And it makes me think that perhaps what we really need is more women at the table.
Yes.
And more women in the Department of Defense, or War, as they call it now, because women bring a different perspective to the table. They look at resistance and they ask, what's causing it? Instead of saying, how do I stop it? Do I put more guns here? Do I put tanks here? Do I bring the National Guard to Washington, D.C.? So there's a very different perspective
So
there.
even resistance can be gendered.
Oh, yes, definitely. That's why 25 years ago, the UN Security Council unanimously passed the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, UNSCR 1325. Unanimous. And this is Security Council, hard-nosed men. What can I say? And they saw the value that women bring in to peace and security. So 1325, or the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, is not about women. It's about peace and security. So if you want a change in the way things are going, bring Diane back to the negotiating table in Gaza. Why don't you?
Nader, I think your point earlier about moral evolution comes back here when it comes to spirituality, because, and I think this isn't necessarily just pegged to organized religion. I would say that the spiritual doesn't just look at things within the physical plane, it looks at it in the metaphysical plane. So how do you measure success? Do you measure success in this life or the hereafter? What are the quantifiable measurements that you want to have? Are you the first to hold the baton in a longer relay race of developing that moral evolution? And then it comes down to intent versus outcome, and where one's focus is. And it allows people to then enfranchise with others who are seeking the same goal of the outcome of resistance, as I said before, irrespective of where that intent might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for picking that up. I think what's sparking for me is a couple of things. One, resistance, whether or not a resistance is justified can also be determined by time, right? In its present moment, it might not be perceived as justifiable, but 10, 20, 30 years later, it could be.
Let's talk about 88 years, the time between the First and the Second Crusade.
Yeah.
From 1099, when Jerusalem is lost, to 1187, when Salahuddin is able to retake it, and also change the entire moral architecture
Exactly.
of how he treated the now conquered, compared to not only how the Crusaders did in the First Crusade, but also how Richard was acting in the Third Crusade by laying siege to Acre and killing all the women and children within. And when Richard falls ill, Salahuddin dispatching his own personal physician.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And sadly, I have to engineer a close to a debate that could go on another day. So forgive me for my terrible attempt at doing so. But tying this all up, and we've come from different angles, whether it's spirituality, the state, corporations, we've identified that there are many forms of resistance. But what I want to identify is what makes one resistance group or form of resistance more successful than others. And I want to go to Diana first.
What makes one more
Successful than others.
successful than the other? I don't know. I'm not sure I can answer that question.
Perfectly fine. I might circle back to you, but I'm going to come to Victor.
No, I believe the Chinese people's war of resistance against Japanese aggressors is an absolute victory. It's a victory for mankind. It's a victory for peace. And this should be viewed as one of the most important victories of the wars of resistance in mankind's history.
Very fascinating. I wonder if things had gone differently, whether our perception of that conflict might have been different. Let's say in an imagined reality where Japan actually did subsume China. Would the Chinese people be a subsect or a minority within a Japanese empire, much of the same like the other ethnic minorities within a Chinese state? Or would it be perceived as...
Assume that worst scenario, I would say every and single one of the Chinese nation at that time, about 700 million, will continue to fight until the last Chinese person standing.
And would it be justified?
To drive out the Japanese aggressors. Now, secondly, using your same rationale, I would say today mankind should unite in putting a stop to any attempt by Japan, who unconditionally surrendered in 1945, and to Nazi Germany, who unconditionally surrendered in 1945, to develop, deploy, and possess and use weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons. I think this has been my singular slogan for quite a few times, and I want to call on everyone I know to join me in demanding that Japan and Germany should never develop and possess and deploy and use weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Victor.
So, Nazir, I'm confused. Is it what has worked or what
makes a resistance group more successful than others?
Okay, so thinking of it that way, it's the question of whether they have support beyond the little silo that they've been living in. And if they have support, using his example as an example, they had the backing of the United States. In other cases, when they have backing of other places as well, then you can see that these movements will take shape, they'll flourish, they will catch fire, and they work. For example, South Africa. But left alone, I wonder.
Part of me is just concerned about history and all the resistance movements that perhaps lost, but had justification from the people, that have disappeared into the obscurity of history.
Absolutely.
And perhaps those don't have the luxury of having their narrative and the purpose for resistance being told. So is the belief from the people enough? I don't know, but there's so many stories perhaps that we don't even know of that have just disappeared as a result of human history. Amina, what about you? What do you believe makes a successful resistance versus an unsuccessful resistance?
Well, I go with what Diana is saying. If you get the support of the bigger community, then it's going to be definitely successful, even if it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. You will never lose that support, and that makes it legitimate. But the question is, how do people know about your fight and therefore be able to support it? Now, because social media is the domain of young people, and they really know how to spread ideas. You see what happened in Jakarta. They were protesting, but still peaceful, until that one motorcycle driver was killed by policemen. And that went viral. And then you started seeing a lot more violent protestations. Then in Nepal, you also had things going viral.
Spark.
So the role of social media here is very important in spreading the idea and getting people to come over to support you. But at the end of the day, if you are fighting against injustice, and this can be genocide in Gaza, people are going to listen and people are going to support you. And that's going to grow over time. The speed depends on which communication channel you have. If you've got a lot of young people, idealistic young people who will support you, then it will be faster. But it will never disappear because the legitimacy is there.
Thank you, Amina. So short and sweet, tying this up, I want to hear from every single one of you a resistance movement that changed the way that you think, changed the way your politics, your belief system, a particularly inspirational resistance movement throughout history that has had a profound impact on your lives. Victor?
As I mentioned, I keep thinking about the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, because that's the single most important existential battle for the Chinese nation and for the Chinese civilization. And in that spirit, I call on the Palestinians to learn what the Chinese nation did between 1931 to 1945 and never give up, and always, putting the strongest resistance possible to regain your freedom, regain your land, and regain your statehood.
Thank you, Victor. Diana?
The obvious for me, which is the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the ANC, and of course the Movement of Liberation in Algeria. Those were the three that were the most formative for me.
What did you take away from those last two?
The last two was the combination of armed resistance and the combination of boycotts, as well as making the movement viral, and also not being apologetic about the use of armed resistance.
Thank you. Saeed?
Let's see. There's a man who decided to challenge the status quo, which was rife with political iniquity and an imbalance of wealth in a society. He had to move away from his own birthplace, establish a community, and did a social reengineering project which moved people outside a tangible social model of a tribe to a transcendental model of a city-state, and in doing so moved from a tangible understanding of the divine to a transcendental model of the divine. And this is the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
I mean, that is probably the archetype of resistance that then changes things spiritually as well as socially and politically.
Beautiful, well said.
Yeah.
Thank you, Saeed.
Yeah.
Amina?
In my case, it was really the bombing of my hometown during the early days of martial law, which gave rise to the Moro National Liberation Front. And seeing the destruction of my home, losing everything that we had, some cousins were killed, and that continuing, that really changed my mindset. But the thing is, my mother always believed in dialogue, that if there is a peaceful way to resolve, even if it's armed conflict, if there's a peaceful way to resolve it, go there first. Because she said, according to our faith, according to Islam, you have to fight against injustice. But if your enemy offers peace, then you must negotiate for the peace. And those two things, the destruction of my home at the start of martial law, and hearing my mother's voice saying that changed everything for me. So we supported all kinds of demonstrations against the war, against the genocide in the South. But at the same time, we were also trying to look for ways within the bureaucracy to try and advance the agenda to stop the fighting. But it took 50 years.
Thank you, Anna. That was beautiful. And thank you, everyone, for contributing such profound and informative remarks that we've all benefited from. So on behalf of everyone watching, our deepest gratitude.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to see more, subscribe to the Doha Debates YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any future episodes.